The numbers flashed red. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't a figure of speech. It was hundreds of values collapsing in real time on the screen, each negative figure larger than the last, a cascade of financial destruction happening with the speed and indifference of a landslide. The noise bleeding in from outside the glass-walled office was the kind of sound you associate with genuine emergencies. Overlapping alarms, voices cutting brutally over each other, someone screaming into a phone with the desperate clarity of a man who already knows it's too late. "We're disconnected. It's an attack. It's a total meltdown." Edward Vance was 40 years old, wearing a charcoal gray Armani suit that cost more than most people earn in a month. And in that exact moment, his tie was ripped loose. His collar was soaked in sweat and his eyes were glued to the monitor as if staring hard enough could reverse reality. His hands flew across the keyboard, or tried to fly because his fingers were trembling with an intensity that turned every keystroke into a gamble. He mistyped, deleted, tried again, missed again. He slammed his closed fist onto the desk. The mug that read "The King" in gold lettering launched through the air, ricocheted off the side of the monitor, and shattered on the floor with a crash that nobody heard because there was too much screaming in the room for a small noise to matter. The coffee bled into the beige carpet in a dark, spreading stain, moving with the patience of things that are in no rush because the damage is already done. Edward stood up, or tried to. His legs absolutely refused to cooperate, and the result was somewhere between standing and collapsing. A pathetic stumble that ended with his knees hitting the floor, right there in the dead center of his glass-walled office, where 30 people on the trading floor could see every second of it. The sob that ripped out of him wasn't the restrained crying of a man holding on to his dignity for as long as possible. It was the guttural wail of a defeat that leaves absolutely nothing standing, the kind of sound a human body makes when the mind permanently gives up on managing its image. "It's over," he said to nobody, to the floor, to the shards of the coffee mug. "My career, the firm, it's all over." The office door was ajar, and standing on the threshold of that door was a woman. Her feet appeared first, worn leather sandals, the kind bought specifically to last, fulfilling that promise for far more years than the manufacturer ever intended. Her sheer pantyhose had a faint run down the right side, that thin line that appears when the fabric begins to surrender, but the time to replace them hasn't quite arrived. The hand gripping the coffee pot was a working hand, not the hand of someone who carries heavy loads, but the hand of someone who carries years, holding the silent history of repetitive strain in the knuckles and joints. Her name was Martha, 58 years old. Gray hair pulled back into a simple bun that made zero attempt to be elegant, because that was never the point. A frayed apron worn over a faded floral dress that had been much more colorful in some previous version of itself. She stood motionless on the threshold, watching the man on his knees on the glass office floor, the violent sobs shaking the shoulders of the Armani suit, the coffee stain widening across the carpet. There was no shock in her expression. There was no sick satisfaction. There was only a calm that was, in itself, deeply disturbing. The calm of someone who has seen too much and learned the hard way that the universe has its own brutal mechanisms for balancing the scales. Mechanisms that run perfectly whether anyone is watching or not. She stood exactly like that for a moment. Then she turned around and walked back down the hallway, with the beat-up coffee pot in her hand, her footsteps completely silent on the same beige carpet that had just absorbed the spilled coffee. But to understand what that woman was doing in that hallway, what was hiding in her eyes in that exact moment, and why her absolute calm was the single most significant thing in all that chaos, we need to go back in time. We need to go back to where the story truly begins, which isn't the day of the disaster. It's the day the disaster was planted. Vance Asset Management occupied the 14th floor of a high-rise in the financial district, and Edward had engineered that space with the cold precision of a man who believes his environment is a direct extension of his own identity. Everything in there communicated a message. The heavy leather chairs in the boardrooms communicated untouchable wealth. The triple monitors on every desk communicated raw capability, and Edward himself communicated, with every step he took down the hall, that he was the kind of man who didn't waste oxygen on things that didn't matter. He stalked the hallways with a very specific quality of movement that everyone around him had learned to recognize and fear. It wasn't a rush. It was a toxic impatience with the rest of the world for failing to keep up with his pace. He barked orders without looking at the people receiving them, not because he was distracted, but based on an unspoken philosophy that the level of eye contact he gave you was mathematically tied to your net worth, and most of the people working for him were worth very little. The interns knew this. They learned fast, usually on day one, the second the first screaming phone call came through. Edward had a habit of dialing the nearest intern's extension, while speedwalking down the hall, actively closing a deal with a client on his cell phone at the same time, using the kid as a punching bag to vent his excess rage. Who ran this risk analysis? This is high school garbage, you are embarrassing me. And then he'd hang up, never waiting for an answer, because the answer was never the point. But there was one person in that office Edward treated slightly differently than the rest. Not better. Different. With the others, there was at least the illusion of a professional relationship, no matter how abusive it was. With Martha, there wasn't even that. There was something much more primal and infinitely more revealing. There was simply the total absence of acknowledgement. It was exactly as if she were a piece of the furniture, and furniture doesn't even deserve the condescension of an elaborate insult. Martha walked into his office every single morning at 10 and at 3 in the afternoon. She knocked discreetly, stepped in, and poured his coffee. Edward rarely stopped what he was doing. He kept talking on the phone, kept hammering the keyboard, kept existing as if the room were completely empty. She placed the fresh cup on the coaster, cleared the old one, and walked out. It was a sterile choreography that had repeated itself so many times, it had become entirely invisible to anyone watching, including Edward himself. Until that Tuesday. Edward was on the line with a heavy-hitting client when Martha walked in with the pot. He grabbed the cup without looking, took a sip, and grimaced. Not the grimace of someone who found the brew too strong or too weak, but a purely performative grimace. The theatrical sneer of a guy who spots an opening to score a cheap laugh and decides to take the shot. He lowered the receiver, covered the mouthpiece with his palm, and turned to the VP at the desk next to him with a volume specifically calibrated to carry across the floor. "What the hell is this?" He pointed at Martha with his chin, acting as if raising a finger was too much physical effort to waste on her. "Smells like an open sewer. This coffee tastes like dirty mop water." He paused, letting the punchline hang. "Is it really that hard to do one single thing right, Miss Martha?" The laugh that escaped him wasn't a happy one. It was a dominance display, a laugh meant to signal the room that the boss made a joke, and the only acceptable response was compliance. The VP next to him chuckled. Another analyst, 2 desks down, who had clearly heard the whole thing, dropped his eyes to his monitor with an embarrassed smirk that was, in itself, a pathetic form of complicity. Martha stood there, gripping the coffee pot, her eyes cast down. There was something incredibly specific about the way she lowered her head. It wasn't the total submission of someone whose spirit was broken, but it wasn't the blazing resistance of someone getting ready to strike back either. It was something right in the middle, a frequency that only exists in people who have spent decades developing a survival instinct on exactly when and how to exist in spaces engineered to keep them out. "I apologize, yes sir," she said. Her accent was a thick Appalachian twang, the drawn-out vowels of a region that the coastal elites use as code for a series of unspoken prejudices that are never said out loud but are understood by everyone in the room. "I'll go change the grounds, excuse me." And she left. Edward was already back on his phone call before the door even clicked shut. The service locker room was buried at the back of the 14th floor, accessible only by a concrete stairwell the cleaning and catering staff were forced to use so they wouldn't clog up the main elevators. It was a cramped, utilitarian box with dented metal lockers and a long wooden bench running down the middle. It smelled like stale coffee and that generic industrial cleaner that all service areas smell of. That neutral, omnipresent chemical scent that is, in itself, just another form of invisibility. Martha was sitting on the wooden bench, her apron neatly folded next to her, slipping off her worn leather sandals with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who does this every single day. A slowness that isn't laziness, but the painful accounting of a body tracking its own mileage. She started massaging her right foot with her thumb, hunting down the pressure points with the brutal precision of someone who had mapped the pain 1,000 times. Penny, the youngest girl on the crew, was 26 and had only been on the job for 6 months. She still carried the easy, hot-blooded indignation of someone who hadn't yet learned that getting angry without a strategy usually destroys the victim much faster than the abuser. "Miss Martha," she said, sitting down on the bench next to her, clutching her coat. "Why do you take it? Every day. Every single day that guy does this, and you apologize for coffee that has absolutely nothing wrong with it." Martha kept pressing her thumb into her arch for a moment, in absolutely no rush to answer. When she finally spoke, Her voice had the heavy texture of things that have been chewed on for a very long time before being spoken out loud. "Child," she said, not even looking at Penny. Her eyes locked on some empty space between the floor and the lockers. "We choose the battles that are actually worth fighting." A pause. "Mine isn't here." Penny stared at her for a long time. What is that supposed to mean? Martha slipped her sandal back onto her bruised foot. She straightened her spine. She picked up her apron and hung it inside the metal locker with the exact precision of a woman who puts things in the exact same spot because she knows she will need them again tomorrow. It means there is more than one way to get exactly where you need to go. She slammed the locker door shut. She turned to Penny with that terrifyingly calm look that wasn't peace. It was total dominance. And some of those ways don't make any noise at all. She grabbed her purse, said goodnight, and walked down the narrow, fluorescent-lit hallway toward the stairs. Penny stayed frozen on the bench for a long minute, staring at the closed metal door, trying to decide if she had just heard something extremely simple or dangerously profound. She concluded correctly that sometimes those two things are the exact same thing. Upstairs on the 14th floor, Edward was finishing his final call of the day, his expensive shoes propped up on his desk, his The King mug refilled with a fresh batch of coffee that Martha had brewed again without complaining, without commenting, leaving absolutely zero trace of the humiliation from an hour ago. He drank the coffee without even realizing it was flawless. It's hard to believe that a human being could violently humiliate another person like that, humiliate them in front of the entire office, weaponize their accent as a punchline, use their hard work as a stage for his own toxic ego, and then blindly drink the exact coffee that person carefully prepared without feeling a single shred of guilt. If you're feeling the heat of this injustice in your gut, smash that like button right now to prove you're standing with Miss Martha. Because that woman who walked down the concrete stairwell with her purse on her arm, her bruised feet, and that cryptic warning on her lips was not just an old lady who poured coffee on the 14th floor. There was a ghost hiding behind those dead calm eyes, a ghost that Edward Vance had looked directly at and completely missed, because he never bothered to actually look. And what he failed to see was about to change everything. The attack started at 2:17 p.m. There was absolutely no way to know that at the time. The realization of the exact timestamp would only come days later, when forensic analysts ripped the timeline apart minute by minute, desperately trying to understand how a breach of that magnitude had completely gutted the systems of a firm that had spent 7 figures on cybersecurity the year before. But at 2:17 p.m. on an entirely average Tuesday, the very first anomaly popped up on the terminal of Ryan, the most junior analyst on the trading floor, manifesting as a string of numbers that absolutely should not have been where they were. He frowned. He keyed in a manual override, waited. The system didn't respond. It didn't freeze up. It didn't throw a fatal error message. It just completely flatlined, as if his command had simply been swallowed by a black hole, a dead vacuum sitting exactly where an instantaneous fiber optic connection used to be. Ryan opened his mouth to flag the senior trader next to him, and that was exactly when the rest of the monitors went off. One by one, then in pairs, then every single screen on the floor all at once. The trading desks started displaying the one thing market operators fear with a blood-chilling specificity that civilians rarely understand. Not a market crash, because crashes have math. They have identifiable triggers. They have theoretical floors. What was actively bleeding across those monitors was entirely different. It was numerical anarchy. Values behaving in psychotic ways that defied every known law of market logic. Massive positions violently opening and closing with zero human input. Heavy artillery orders being executed that nobody in the building had authorized. Someone was inside the house. The first voice to scream was Henry's, the desk manager. "We're disconnected, it's an attack." And then, with a sheer terror that transformed the multi-million-dollar office into a war zone in a matter of seconds, came the confirmation nobody wanted to hear. "It's a total meltdown. Everything is melting down." The firm's cybersecurity protocols cascaded into action, quarantining terminals, severing external connections, freezing all outbound operations. It was the textbook protocol. It was also, in that highly specific nightmare scenario, a lethal double-edged sword. While it stopped the malware from digging deeper into the architecture, it simultaneously locked the traders out of doing absolutely anything to stop the bleeding that was already happening. The open positions were completely exposed. The safety hedges failed to execute. The massive portfolio Edward had aggressively built over the last 18 months. The millions in client funds he managed using the carefully engineered trust of a 10-year reputation, all of it was being slaughtered in real time by lines of malicious code that had no face, no office, and no address. Inside his glass-walled office, Edward had spent the first 3 minutes of the invasion doing exactly what you are never supposed to do. Trying to violently force the locked systems, trying to bypass the security firewalls, hammering in emergency overrides that the server simply ignored because the server was in a bunker and wasn't taking orders anymore. It was the panicked reaction of a man who had spent a decade expecting the world to bow when he pushed the right buttons. And now the buttons were dead, and every second of dead air was another $1 million of his client's money evaporating into a digital void he couldn't see or touch. His hands shook uncontrollably. He mistyped the keys, deleted, hammered them again. He yanked the main monitor cable out of the rig with a violent jerk, acting as if physically severing the hardware could somehow kill the cancer in the software. It didn't. The massive screen just went pitch black, and the black was, in a horrifying way, infinitely worse than the red numbers. At least the red numbers were data, they were reality. They were a monster you could actually fight. The black was just the void. He stood up. His legs refused to carry the weight they were built to carry, and the result was that pathetic stumble that ended with his knees hitting the beige carpet, right next to the jagged shards of the coffee mug, landing squarely in the puddle of coffee that had already gone cold. 30 people on the trading floor could see him through the glass. Some stared. Most aggressively looked away with that civilized corporate survival instinct of refusing to witness the total destruction of a man who holds power over you. Because you never know if that power is going to claw its way back out of the grave. The sob that ripped out of Edward had absolutely none of the polished restraint of public emotion. It was the wail of a system undergoing total collapse. Harsh, jagged, tearing out of his throat in violent spasms that shook the tailored shoulders of the Armani suit in ways the fabric was never stitched to endure. "I'm going to prison," he told the carpet. "The clients are going to kill me, my career. It's all over. It's all over, it's—" The sentence kept looping in variations, a broken record, his mind spinning its tires in the mud because it had completely derailed and couldn't find anything solid to grab onto. That same man who had strutted down the hallways like a god, who had verbally slaughtered interns over the phone with the casual ease of checking the weather, who had pointed his chin at a woman in a frayed apron and publicly declared her coffee smelled like an open sewer while his lackeys laughed. That man was now on his hands and knees in his own office, reduced to a weeping infant by the exact same arrogance that made him believe his empire was bulletproof, just because he was bulletproof. And there was a woman standing perfectly still on the threshold of the door, watching the entire breakdown with a dead calm expression that was, in itself, a devastating commentary. Here we must pause this story for just a second, because there is something in this scene that is too heavy to ignore. The man who had called this woman ignorant, who had weaponized her accent for a cheap joke, who had swallowed the coffee she brewed every single day without ever registering her existence as a human being worthy of basic eye contact. That man was now shattered in a million pieces on the floor, and she was standing tall, completely whole, absolutely serene. If you feel the silent, ruthless justice unfolding in this room, hit that like button right now to prove you're standing with Miss Martha. She waited for the first violent peak of his crying to burn out, not out of coldness, but out of a surgical read of the room. She had learned over 58 hard years that there are moments when talking is completely useless, not because your words are wrong, but because the person bleeding out on the floor is physically incapable of hearing them yet. She waited for the sharpest frequency of his panic to drop a few decibels. Then she took one step into the glass office. "Mr. Vance." The voice carried that thick Appalachian twang, the drawn-out vowels, the heavy cadence that the coastal elites constantly treat as proof of low intelligence, when in reality, it is simply proof of a different history, not an inferior one, just different. Her voice was dead calm in the way that only a person who truly knows exactly what they are doing can be calm, completely devoid of the forced effort of someone faking it. "Mind if I take a look?" Edward jerked his head up from the carpet. His eyes were bloated, his face flushed and wet, his expensive silk tie twisted into a knot that under any other circumstance would just be sloppy, but right now looked like the structural collapse of his entire identity. He stared at Martha, the beat-up pot in her hand, the frayed apron, the gray hair pulled into that cheap bun, and what flashed across his face was a rapid, highly revealing sequence. First, the pure confusion of a man who cannot compute why this specific NPC has wandered into the room. then the jarring recognition of exactly who she was, and finally, moving with the speed of a loaded spring, raw rage. Because rage is all that's left in the tank when pride has absolutely nothing else left to defend. It is the final layer of armor, even when it's completely shot to pieces. "Get the hell out of here, woman." His voice was shredded from crying, which only made it uglier than it normally would be. Hoarse and rabid, a combination that looks pathetic on any man. He pointed a shaking finger straight at the door. "You ignorant piece of trash. What the hell are you going to do? Bring me more coffee that smells like a sewer." The words ripped out of his throat and hung like toxic gas in the air of the glass office. Out on the trading floor, some of the 30 people who had a clear line of sight through the glass snapped their heads around. Not all of them. Some were too buried in the apocalypse of the trading desk to process another one of the boss's temper tantrums. But some of them saw it. And they also saw exactly what happened next. Martha didn't move a muscle. She didn't take a step back. She didn't drop her eyes to the floor. She didn't apologize. And the complete absence of that apology was, in itself, a terrifying new variable in that room. Because Martha had always apologized. It was the automatic programmed response the environment had beaten into her over the months. And right now, she simply refused to deliver it. She stood frozen in the exact same spot, the coffee pot in her grip. Her eyes locked onto Edward with a look that wasn't rebellion and wasn't surrender. It was the dead-eyed stare of a sniper who has already pulled the trigger and is simply waiting for the bullet to hit the target. The silence between them lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Edward was still on his knees, his shaking finger aimed at the door, waiting for her to obey the command. And she wasn't obeying. And with every agonizing second that ticked by without her compliance, his aggressive gesture lost more of its power, became more physically exhausting to hold up, revealing exactly how much his entire authority relied on a cooperation she had silently decided to permanently revoke. He lowered his finger. Not dramatically, he just dropped it, overwhelmed by the crushing exhaustion of a man who literally has no more adrenaline left to run the simulation. He looked back at the dead black monitor, at the office that felt like a tomb while the trading floor outside still boiled with screaming voices and blaring alarms, at the broken shards of the mug on the floor. Martha was still standing in the exact same spot, waiting. There was a moment, a single fleeting moment, when Edward could have said something smart. He could have shut his mouth. He could have asked the right question. He could have used the raw intelligence he genuinely possessed, the intelligence currently suffocating under a blanket of sheer panic, to actually evaluate what the hell was happening right in front of him. He didn't. "Are you deaf?" His voice was still jagged, still dripping with the residue of a breakdown, but desperately trying to claw its way back to the alpha dog tone that had been his default state for a decade. "Get out! This is none of your damn business. Go grab your little pot and—" Martha walked over to his executive leather chair and sat down. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't a theatrical claiming of territory with sweeping movements and grand speeches. It was simply the absolute, undeniable movement of a woman who identified the exact coordinates of where she needed to be and placed herself there, with the exact same casual muscle memory she used to cross that threshold 100 times, carrying a tray of coffee. She sat down in a leather chair that cost 3 times her monthly salary, shifted her hips slightly so her worn sandals planted firmly on the floor mat, and rested her fingers on the keyboard. The hands hovering over that mechanical keyboard were absolutely not the hands Edward had watched pour coffee for 6 months. Not because they magically changed. They were the exact same hands, carrying the exact same scars of manual labor, the exact same swollen joints, the exact same short, unpainted nails. But there was something in the brutal, hyper-focused geometry of how they locked onto the keys that was completely alien to everything he had ever associated with that woman. It was the lethal posture of someone who knows the instrument, the stance of a ghost who doesn't need to look down at the keys because her muscle memory knows exactly where they are in the dark. Her fingers began to move, and Edward stood frozen, his jaw slack, just watching. She didn't try to hack into the systems he had been trying to force, the standard trader terminals that were hard-locked by the quarantine protocols, frozen solid, completely useless. Instead, her fingers ripped through backdoor pathways he only vaguely recognized, like a guy who drove down a street a few times but never actually walked the pavement. They were the risk analysis infrastructure terminals, not the flashy execution boards, but the deep system monitoring feeds that the security protocol had left partially alive because the firewalls physically needed eyes to map the blast radius in real time. Most of the suits working on that floor didn't even know those terminals existed. Not because they were classified, but because there was zero reason a frontline fund manager would ever need to touch the raw code in their day-to-day life. They were pure infrastructure tools, completely invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were hunting for. Martha knew. Her hand snapped open 3 overlapping windows in a rapid-fire sequence, each one vomiting a density of raw data that would have taken Edward 10 minutes just to orient himself in. She read them in 3 seconds, not with the slow linear reading of a guy processing new math, but with the brutal diagonal scanning of an apex predator recognizing blood patterns she had mapped 1,000 times before. Her eyes flicked across the glowing screens with that highly specific, terrifying quality that only veteran traders possess. She wasn't reading the individual numbers. She was letting the entire topography of the data communicate the threat, spotting the anomalies purely by contrast, not by analysis. Edward had completely transitioned out of his crying spell and crashed into a different, equally paralyzing state. The total, brain-breaking confusion of a man actively watching something that aggressively violates every single rule of the universe he built in his head. He stood paralyzed next to his own chair, not knowing what to do with his hands, his eyes violently ping-ponging between the scrolling code and Martha's face. He looked like a man trying to force a square peg into a round hole, watching in pure horror as the peg slides perfectly into place. Then she started trading, not through the sleek, user-friendly GUI windows, through a raw command line interface she pulled up using a sequence of keyboard shortcuts Edward had seen exactly once, 5 years ago, during a developer pitch, and had completely dumped from his memory because he thought he was too important to ever need it. She was typing without pausing, without hesitating, completely devoid of that hunting and pecking rhythm of a tourist. She typed like a woman speaking her native tongue. The assets she started aggressively shifting were the absolute last ones Edward would have ever touched in that scenario. In any scenario, really, they were positions that violently contradicted the conventional logic of damage control, sprinting in the exact opposite direction of standard defensive protocol. She was opening massive short positions in sectors that looked, on the surface, completely disconnected from the bleeding. "What the hell are you doing?" Edward's voice had lost its rage and crossed into an entirely new dimension. It wasn't panic. It was that specific gut-twisting tension of a guy watching someone pull a pin on a grenade and having no idea if they're going to throw it or hold it. "Are you insane? You're going to permanently sink us. Get away from the desk. Get up right now." He reached out and clamped his hand down on her shoulder, a heavy, gripping pressure that wasn't quite violence, but was an absolutely clear physical command to move. Martha stopped typing. She turned her head slowly and stared at the hand gripping her shoulder. Then she dragged her eyes up to Edward's face, wearing an expression he had never seen on the face of a single human being who worked for him. And there was something so completely radioactive in that stare that his hand physically detached from her shoulder before his brain even issued the conscious order to let go. It was an involuntary reflex, the nervous system violently pulling back from a hot stove. It was absolute authority, not the fake performative authority of a guy who read a book on corporate leadership. Real, bone-crushing authority. The kind that doesn't need to yell, doesn't need a fancy job title, doesn't need a custom gold-lettered coffee mug. The authority that radiates from someone who actually knows exactly what the hell they are doing. "Stay quiet." 2 words, and the drawl was gone. Not the thick Appalachian twang Edward had used as a cheap punchline. The accent he treated as a neon sign for stupidity. The voice he secretly mocked with the casual, lazy cruelty of a prejudice he never had to defend. The voice that cut through the room right now had no region, no social class, absolutely none of the demographic markers Edward relied on to categorize her and shove her into the filing cabinet of the invisible. It was the voice of a ghost who had weaponized that accent like camouflage, deploying it the way dangerous people hide knives, not out of shame, but because they understand that the world bleeds its darkest secrets when it thinks you aren't smart enough to pay attention. Edward stayed quiet. Martha went back to the keyboard. The minutes that followed were the most terrifyingly surreal moments of Edward Vance's entire professional life, and the man had survived a decade of Wall Street bloodbaths. He stood frozen next to his own executive chair, a chair currently occupied by a woman he had called ignorant to her face, who was now flawlessly executing deep system override commands he barely understood, and he just watched. He watched her isolate the malware's attack vector with a ruthless precision. The cybersecurity team outside the glass was still desperately trying to locate. He watched her hard-code a real-time hedging structure, stringing together violently disconnected assets using a brutal, abstract math that took his brain 3 full minutes to even start to comprehend. And when he finally saw it, when the architecture of her trap finally clicked in his head, he was hit by a wave of pure awe, wrapped in a very specific, suffocating nausea. The nausea of realizing you are staring at a level of genius infinitely superior to your own, wielded by a human being you wouldn't even grant the basic dignity of saying good morning to. The numbers on the screen stopped plummeting. Not all at once. There was no cinematic flair to this, it was just cold, hard math. They stopped the exact same way a severed artery stops bleeding when you jam a thumb into the right pressure point. Slowly at first, then aggressively, and finally with the undeniable clarity that the momentum had entirely shifted. The trap Martha had built was actively hunting the attack, deploying a massive counterweight structure that was neutralizing the financial bleeding in blind spot sectors the hackers had clearly never factored into their code. One number flipped to green, then another. Then, in a rapid-fire sequence that violently accelerated as the short positions locked in, an entire column of the firm's portfolio started aggressively clawing back every single dollar it had bled out over the last 40 minutes. Edward stood staring at the monitor with a look on his face that has no name in the English language, because it was forged from emotions that are never supposed to exist in the same room. The hysterical relief of watching the apocalypse get cancelled, the brain-melting confusion of not understanding how the physics of his reality were still working, and underneath it all, creeping up his spine like a slow-acting poison he desperately wanted to ignore but couldn't, was the shame. Not the shame of blowing a trade. He knew how to handle that. There was a corporate playbook for bad trades. There were slick PR narratives about volatile markets and sophisticated state-sponsored hacks, and the tragic reality that no firewall is bulletproof. This was the other shame, the one with no playbook. The gut-rotting horror that detonates in your chest when you realize you had arrogantly judged a book you never bothered to open, that you had treated a god like a cockroach, that you had publicly announced the coffee tasted like a sewer when it was brewed by the exact hands currently saving your entire empire from the ashes. Martha kept hammering the keys for a few more minutes, micro-adjusting the kill switch positions with the cold focus of a professional who isn't done until the body is actually in the bag. Then she stopped. She stared at the matrix of data for a long beat, verifying the stabilized parameters with that diagonal predator's scan. She gave a microscopic nod to herself, not a victory pump, just the private, internal sign-off of a mechanic who fixed the engine. She pushed the heavy leather chair back slightly, getting ready to stand up. Edward was still frozen beside her. Jaw-dropped wasn't the right word, it was something deeper, the hollowed-out look a man gets when the shock isn't physical, but structural. The look of a guy whose entire internal universe just collided with reality and lost in a total knockout. Outside the glass walls, some of the 30 people who had a clear line of sight into the office had completely stopped breathing. The trading floor was still in red alert crisis mode, the analysts still desperately trying to run diagnostics on the blast zone. But there was something drastically different happening on the master monitors, and anyone on that floor with a high enough IQ to read the shift was currently staring at the boss's glass office with an expression that was, in itself, a massive, unanswerable question. The coffee lady had just done what the entire floor couldn't, and she was still holding the beat-up coffee pot in her left hand. The office had finally clawed its way back to something resembling normalcy, not true normalcy, which would take weeks of forensic audits to rebuild, but that provisional battlefield normalcy that kicks in when the bomb stops ticking and people are just trying to count the bodies. But at least the bleeding has stopped. Phones were ringing again, keyboards were clattering, the familiar hum of the machine booting back up in safe mode. Inside the glass office, there were only 2 people. Martha had stood up from the executive chair with the exact same fluid, unbothered motion she had used to sit down. No grand announcement, no dramatic sigh, just a woman clocking out of one job and moving to the next. She picked up the coffee pot she had parked on the mahogany desk, checked the weight to make sure it wasn't empty, and squared her shoulders toward the door. "Who?" Edward's voice slipped out of his mouth before his brain even authorized the question. It came from that primal place where desperate questions live before they are formatted, a place that completely bypassed his corporate filter. "Who are you?" Martha stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She just stood there for a heavy second, her back to him, gripping the coffee pot, her gray hair locked in that cheap bun. And in that single second, You could feel the physical weight of a choice being made. The choice to pull the pin. The choice to finally use the words she had kept buried in the dark for a very long time. Not by accident, but because the industry that stole them from her absolutely did not deserve to hear them again. Then she turned. She pulled off the cheap drugstore reading glasses she had used to hack the terminal, the flimsy wire frames, slightly bent on the left side. The kind you buy off a spinning rack for $5 because they work, not because they look good. She held them in her hand and locked eyes with Edward, eyes he had looked directly into 100 times without ever actually seeing. "My full name," she said, and her voice carried that exact same flat, accentless, terrifyingly precise tone she had used to order him to stay quiet. "Is Maria Aparecida dos Santos Ferreira." A pause. "On the Chicago boards, from 2002 to 2008 I was listed as M.A. Santos." Edward stood completely paralyzed, because M.A. Santos was a name that anyone with more than 10 minutes of history in the financial markets had heard. Not necessarily a face you could pick out of a lineup, not necessarily a fully documented biography, but a mythical string of numbers that had crossed over into the kind of dark folklore Wall Street builds around its inexplicable anomalies. Rate of return records that senior quants whispered about like they were alien technology. A ruthless hedging methodology that had literally been dissected in at least 2 Ivy League grad school programs before she vanished off the face of the earth. And the algorithm quietly became the intellectual property of men who hadn't written a single line of it. 15 years ago, Martha continued, her voice carrying the heavy, exhausted cadence of someone telling a ghost story they are violently sick of telling. I was the lead derivatives trader at one of the biggest clearinghouses in Chicago. I was 32 years old. I had shattered 6 consecutive firm profit records in an 18-month window. She paused. Not for the theater of it. She paused to select the exact surgical words, because the truth didn't need any dramatic dressing. And then I found out my managing director was using my trading algorithms as a blind to launder cartel money. The massive legitimate yields I was pulling in were the perfect smokescreen for the blood money he was running underneath. Edward had found the glass wall behind him without even realizing his feet were moving. He had slowly backed away from her until his spine hit the cold glass, and now he was leaning against it with the hollow look of a man who desperately needs the building to hold him up. I blew the whistle. The 3 words dropped out of her mouth with a brutal simplicity that carried a tonnage of trauma. 3 words are rarely forced to hold. I went to compliance, then the SEC. I had the paper trail. I had everything. The pause that followed had its own physical texture in the room. They sued me into the ground before the federal case against him even hit the halfway mark. Defamation. Market manipulation. They literally weaponized my own trading logs as evidence, entirely recontextualized by a team of defense attorneys who billed more per hour than I made in a month when I started. My trading licenses were suspended, while the litigation dragged on. It dragged for 4 years. Her eyes never left Edward's face for a fraction of a second. In year 4, my husband packed a bag and left. In year 5, my daughter stopped answering my phone calls. A shorter, sharper pause. The director paid a heavily negotiated administrative fine, kept his Series 7, and is still actively managing billions of dollars today. The beat-up coffee pot in Martha's right hand was tilted at a slight angle, her fingers wrapped around the plastic handle with the muscle memory of an object carried like a cross for years. I exiled myself to the only profession the industry let me keep, she said. And swimming inside those words was a complex alloy of things that were impossible to separate. There was a suffocating grief. There was a rage that time had distilled into something infinitely colder and sharper than anger. And underneath it all, acting as the foundation, was a kind of titanium that wasn't bitterness at all. It was pure survival, melted down and forged into a spine, serving coffee. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There were a million things he could say. There was the executive crisis management playbook every VP memorizes, the slick corporate phrases designed to defuse bombs, the legalistic apologies that acknowledge pain without admitting liability, the art of showing gratitude without giving up leverage. He had deployed those weapons 1,000 times. They were highly effective tools, but they were catastrophically inadequate for the gravity of this room, and some fractured piece of his brain, probably the piece that had been weeping into the beige carpet an hour ago and hadn't fully recovered its arrogance, actually knew it. "The man who called me ignorant," Martha said, and the surgical precision of every syllable wasn't an act of cruelty. It was simply the absolute refusal to cushion, to soften, to make a brutal truth more digestible for a weak stomach. The man who mocked my accent for cheap laughs in front of his frat boys, who made a theatrical little face at the coffee I brewed and announced to the floor that it smelled like a sewer. Her eyes bored into his, radiating the exact same intensity he had stupidly mistaken for submission for 6 months, finally allowing him to see it for the apex predator gaze it had always been. Just had his entire career saved from the slaughterhouse by the ignorant trash who pours his coffee. She tightened her grip on the pot, turned on her heel, and walked toward the door. "Wait!" Edward's voice cracked like a whip, fueled by an uncalculated, desperate urgency. I can... You can what? She stopped walking, but she didn't turn around. She spoke directly to the closed door in front of her, her voice completely flat. Not cold, not furious, just entirely devoid of any expectation that could possibly be disappointed, because the expectation had died a decade ago. "Give me a raise? Pay for a coding boot camp?" The questions hit him exactly the way disarming truths always hit, not with brute force but with lethal accuracy. Because buried inside those questions was the entire pathetic arsenal of hollow corporate band-aids the world usually offers to the people it destroys, highlighting the cosmic, laughable inadequacy of those gestures against the scale of the actual damage. A bump in hourly pay for the coffee lady, offered to a genius who had engineered algorithms studied in Ivy League grad schools. A training course, offered to a woman who had shattered 6 consecutive Wall Street records before being annihilated by a machine that actively punishes honesty. Edward choked on the sentence about the raise and the promotion right where it started to form in his throat. Martha resumed her walk toward the door. Outside the glass walls, the 30 traders who had spent the last 40 minutes watching this silent movie play out through the glass were locked in different variations of silence. Some trapped in the silence of guys who didn't fully grasp the code but understood the power dynamic. Others in the silence of guys who understood exactly what she did and were currently processing the terrifying implications. And a few, the youngest ones, the interns who still had a pulse and hadn't learned to bury their souls yet. In the silence of kids feeling something so heavy, it was going to take them years to find the right words for it. The office door swung open. Martha walked down the hallway with the beat-up coffee pot in her hand, the frayed apron, the worn leather sandals, the gray hair pulled back in that cheap bun. She walked down the exact same corridor she had crossed hundreds of times in the opposite direction, arriving with fresh coffee, leaving with the dirty cups. She walked with the exact same rhythm she always had, not a second faster, because she wasn't running from anything, and not a second slower, because she wasn't waiting for anyone. She hit the service stairwell, pushed the heavy fire door open, and right before she vanished into the concrete tunnel that dropped down to the locker room, she turned her head one final time, not back toward Edward, who was still leaning against the glass wall looking like a man trying to glue a shattered universe back together, but toward the main floor, toward the 30 people who were dead silent, staring at her. She didn't say a single word. There was absolutely nothing left to say that the silence couldn't say louder. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind her. He was standing there when she arrived. The locker room door was buried at the dead end of the service corridor. On the side of the building the express elevators didn't service, the side the millionaire clients never saw. It was 6:40 a.m., the exact time Martha had clocked in every day for 2 years, always beating the rest of the support staff, carrying the rigid punctuality of someone who cannot afford the luxury of being late. And Edward Vance was leaning against the cinderblock wall next to the door, with the haggard, hollowed-out look of a man who hasn't slept a wink and has completely given up trying to hide it. He was wearing the exact same charcoal suit from yesterday. It was aggressively wrinkled now. The expensive silk tie was gone and the collar of his dress shirt was unbuttoned. His eyes carried that bruised purple swelling that only comes from long, agonizing nights where the brain refuses to cut the engine even when the body is begging for mercy. He had spent the entire night doing the math, not the financial math, which the forensic accountants, the lawyers, and the cybersecurity feds were handling, but the other math, the ledger that doesn't fit on a spreadsheet. When he saw her shadow appear at the end of the hall, he pushed himself off the wall and straightened his spine. Not the arrogant chest-out peacock strut he usually deployed, but the heavy, reluctant posture of a guy forcing himself to stand up because his gut tells him it's the absolute bare minimum he owes. Martha stopped 6 feet away from him. She stared at him, wearing that exact same mask she had adopted as a second skin. The dead calm armor that leaks absolutely nothing to the outside world. that quietly observes, calculates, and decides exactly how much ammunition to spend and when to pull the trigger. She waited. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. He had actively rehearsed this pitch all night long. He had run simulations. He had thrown out the versions that sounded too stiff, the ones that sounded too chummy, the ones that sounded like a legal admission of guilt, and the ones that sounded like a dirty bribe. He had walked into that service hallway an hour ago, completely convinced he had the winning script. Staring at her in the fluorescent light, he realized he had absolutely nothing. "I want to offer you," he started. And there was a grit in his voice that was completely alien to his brand. The grit of genuine, bleeding humility, which is a completely different animal than the fake, performative humility CEOs practice in mirror exercises. It was clunky, it was agonizingly slow, and it was real. A desk on the main trading floor, senior quantitative analyst to start, but with a completely unobstructed track to, he swallowed hard, to wherever your talent dictates you should be. Another painful pause, and a compensation package that reflects reality, to make up for it. Those last 5 words slipped out of his mouth and hung in the stagnant air of the hallway, carrying that pathetic glass jaw fragility of words that realize the exact second they are spoken, that they are catastrophically too weak to carry the weight they've been assigned. Martha stared at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It wasn't a victorious laugh. It wasn't even the bitter, cynical laugh of someone finding dark irony in a miserable situation. It was a short, involuntary bark that slipped out simply because there was something genuinely, cosmically absurd about that specific phrase. To make up for it, when measured against the towering, blood-soaked invoice Edward was trying, with all the naive goodwill of one sleepless night, to start paying off. To make up for it, she repeated, and the words left her mouth with a tone that completely bypassed anger. It was the surgical precision of a butcher trimming the fat off a bone. She locked eyes with him, eyes that had seen the absolute worst of the world and had kept their mouth shut for a very long time. "You honestly think a desk makes up for it?" Edward opened his mouth to speak. "The morning's freezing at the bus stop at 5:30 a.m., waiting in the dark for a transit line that's always late, just so I can get here in time to scrub the filth off the city." She wasn't yelling. She was doing the exact opposite of yelling. She was speaking in a terrifyingly low register, wrapping every syllable in a containment field that made it hit 10 times harder than a scream. "The years I spent pouring coffee for empty suits who wouldn't even grant me the dignity of eye contact, who literally talked over my head like I was a potted plant." She took a breath that carried the crushing weight of a decade of silence. "The nights my daughter would call me, and I had absolutely no way to explain to her why I couldn't come home with a shred of dignity, because the industry I bled for my entire life had unilaterally decided I was dead." Edward didn't say a word, because there was absolutely nothing to say. Not because the English language failed him, but because any word he could possibly summon would be pathetic compared to the devastating silence her words had just built in that hallway. "I don't want your world," Martha said, and baked into those 6 words was a terminal finality that had nothing to do with resentment. It was a verdict. The kind of verdict that takes years of bleeding to reach, and when it finally arrives, it requires absolutely zero explanation. "I've already lived in it. I know exactly what it demands. I know exactly what it does to the human soul." She looked at Edward's wrinkled Armani suit, at his bloodshot, insomniac eyes, at the ghost of the man who had sobbed on his hands and knees into his own carpet. "You are the living proof." She dug into her purse and pulled out the brass key to her locker. She took one step toward the heavy metal door, and stopped. She stood frozen like that for a split second, her back to him, the key pinched in her fingers, radiating the distinct energy of a sniper who remembered they had 1 bullet left in the chamber, had already picked the target and was just waiting for the wind to die down. The wind had just died down. When she slowly turned back around, the mask had slipped. It wasn't the dead calm serenity of the invisible observer anymore, and it wasn't the airtight restraint of someone bearing their trauma. It was lethal, unadulterated clarity, the face of someone finally delivering the absolute last line of the script. "Oh, and about yesterday," her voice was a flat line, crystal clear, utterly devoid of any theatrical villainous threat, because a loaded gun doesn't need to act scary. "I recorded the entire thing." Edward turned to stone. "The panic attack. The sobbing. You on your knees on the floor. The screaming about going to federal prison." A tactical pause. And then, the part where you called me an ignorant piece of trash while I was actively saving your life on the terminal. Another pause, shorter this time, twisting the knife. I encrypted the audio and bounced it to my attorney's secure server last night. It's safe. The fluorescent hallway was dead silent. There wasn't another soul in the basement. It was way too early, and the service wing was a ghost town anyway. But the silence felt physically heavier than it had a minute ago, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. "I'm not pulling the trigger on it right now," Martha said, wielding that terrifying precision of a woman who has completely mapped the chessboard. "I have absolutely zero intention of using it, as long as you don't give me a reason." Her eyes locked onto his with a gravitational pull that wasn't intimidation. It was the pure, unblinking reality of a player who isn't bluffing. "But if you ever, for a single second, entertain the thought of taking credit for saving those funds, or if you ever try to blackball me, or if you ever try to use a single shred of yesterday's disaster as leverage," she let it hang in the air. "The file goes public. The entire file." She let the radioactive implications of that threat arrange themselves inside Edward's brain, because she knew his quantitative intelligence worked perfectly, and all she had to do was put the variables on the board and let him run the math himself. A Wall Street titan found in total psychological collapse, completely paralyzed, weeping on his knees, saved from total annihilation by a janitor he had sadistically humiliated. A janitor he actively tried to physically stop from saving his own portfolio. That was the headline. It was a narrative that wouldn't just nuke the illusion of alpha dog competence he had spent 10 years cultivating. It would permanently, violently erase his entire identity from the industry. "And then," Martha said, and for the first and absolute last time something crossed her face that wasn't exactly a smile, but occupied the exact same real estate. A razor-thin lightness that wasn't sadistic, but was completely deeply aware of the kill shot she was delivering. King. Who on earth is going to trust their millions to a man who had a mental breakdown and had to be rescued by the coffee lady? Edward stared at her with a look that had burned right through disbelief, blasted past calculated panic, and crash-landed in a totally foreign territory that was a sickening hybrid of the two. The horrified recognition of a guy who realizes the game is permanently over, and that the woman standing in front of him had orchestrated the checkmate with a level of genius that he, with all his Ivy League degrees, hadn't even seen coming. Martha slid the brass key into the locker room deadbolt. "Good morning, Edward." It was the very first time she had ever used his first name, stripping away the Sir and the Mr. Vance. It was a microscopic change in vocabulary. It was simultaneously the total destruction of his entire world. She walked into the locker room. The heavy steel door swung shut behind her with a soft, definitive click. Outside, in the flickering fluorescent light of the hallway, Edward stood completely paralyzed for a length of time he couldn't measure. He stared at the closed metal door. He looked down at his own hands that hadn't shaken this violently since yesterday, when the red numbers were falling, and he was completely powerless to stop them. He looked down the empty hollow corridor that led back to the main elevator, back to the 14th floor, back to the glass-walled office with the beige carpet that still held the dark, permanent stain of spilled coffee. And he took the long walk back, in total silence, with absolutely no one around to witness that he had made the trip, or what he had found at the end of the hall. That night, at exactly 7:20 p.m., Martha walked out the grand front entrance of the high-rise, not through the rusted service doors in the alley, but through the revolving glass doors in the main lobby, because her shift was over, and the rules didn't matter anymore. The frayed apron was neatly folded in her purse, the worn leather sandals beat a familiar rhythm against the concrete, and her gray hair had finally escaped the tight bun that had held it hostage for an 8-hour shift. She turned left on the sidewalk, not toward the bus stop that would take her back to her cramped apartment. She walked toward the technical college 3 blocks down, toward a classroom that smelled like cheap AC and vending machine coffee, where 23 people with radically different ages and scars gathered 3 nights a week to learn advanced Python and machine learning. Martha beat the professor to the room. She pulled out a spiral notebook. She flipped to the exact line of code where she had left off on Tuesday. The look burning in her eyes as she waited for the lecture to start was not the look of someone who had just won a war. It wasn't the adrenaline rush of wielding a blackmail file. It wasn't the smug satisfaction of rejecting a 6-figure job offer. And it wasn't even the cathartic relief of a woman who finally spit out the poison she had been swallowing for a decade. It was something infinitely simpler and far more dangerous than any of those things. It was the face of a person who is building. Not building toward Edward Vance. Not building in spite of a corrupt market that had tried to erase her existence. Building towards something that was entirely hers. Something that absolutely did not require a permission slip from the universe to exist. Something she was stacking brick by brick on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights in a sterile classroom that smelled like Freon. The most absolute devastating revenge on Earth isn't the one that destroys the person who broke you. It's the revenge that proves completely in the dark, without an audience, that the fire they tried to put out never actually died. It was just waiting for the wind to change, preparing to burn hotter, smarter, and more ruthlessly independent than it ever was before. Now I'm asking you, if you were in Martha's shoes, what would your next move be? Would you have taken Edward's high-paying job offer to force your way back into the empire that locked you out? Or would you have played it exactly like she did, keeping the audio file as a loaded gun and walking away to build your own kingdom from scratch? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. This story is cold, hard proof that being treated like a ghost is never an accurate measure of your actual worth. It is only a measure of the catastrophic blindness of the people who refuse to look. That genius kept in the dark doesn't rot. It ferments, it sharpens, and it cuts infinitely deeper when it finally hits the light. And that the most lethal revenge isn't the kind that screams and humiliates. It's the kind that quietly builds an empire in the shadows, far away from the eyes of the people who called you a fool. If you want more stories that rip your heart out and put it back together, smash subscribe and ring the bell to join the crew.